Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Oliver Wieck. I'm the Secretary General of ICC Germany. Together with Volker Treyer, Chief Executive of Foreign Trade Association of German Chambers of Commerce and Industry, I warmly welcome you today to the workshop on tomorrow's supply chains, the final event of ICC's International Forum, The Future of International Supply Chains, Sustainable, Digital and Smart. The series of events started in June with our opening event together with the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, Pamela Cook-Hamilton, two German Secretaries of State, the CEO of Deutsche Post, Dr. Frank Appel, ICC Secretary General John Denton, and ICC Germany's Chairman, Dr. Holger Bingmann, who is also here today. As a global business organization, it is ICC's mission to address the daily challenges faced by business of all sizes around the world and to develop and promote solutions through our network with the goal to make business work for everyone, every day and everywhere. This is why at this year's ICC Forum, we have been looking at the benefits and the challenges of international supply chains. We have discussed the opportunities of supply chain finance with international experts from European and Asian banks and corporates. We have elaborated new business possibilities along the digitalization of international supply chains with corporates and startups. We have talked about new initiatives to move from a linear to circular supply chains, and we have discussed with the UN, the EU, and experts from multinational companies about supply chain due diligence. Today, we will try to venture a further look into the future of supply chains by looking at the geo-economic challenges, the impact of the supply chain management, and the digitalization of foreign trade. But first is it time to express a big thank you to our partners, starting with today's host, the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce, who invited us to their headquarters, the so-called Haus der Deutschen Wirtschaft here in Berlin. Thank you, Volker, for inviting us, and thank you for your team for making this possible. A special gratitude goes to Deutsche Post DHL, our main sponsor and partner, who has been supporting us from day one. Our thanks also go to ODDO BHF, KPMG, BuyCo, our media partner, DVV Media Group, and our network partners, BDI, Federation of German Industries, and of course, DIHK. All of you provided substantial support and guidance throughout the whole workshop series. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I also want to mention the incredible support of the global ICC network. With the support of the International Secretariat in Paris and various national committees, this ICC forum has gathered more than 800 participants from 82 countries all over the world. Thank you for joining forces with us. Before starting with our first panel discussion, let me introduce you to Dr. Volker Treyer. As I said, he's the Chief Executive of Foreign Trade and member of the Executive Board of the Association of German Chambers of Industry and Commerce. He's responsible for the network of binational German chambers, delegations, representations of German industry and commerce in 92 countries worldwide, and an expert in international and European economic affairs. Thank you again, Volker, for hosting our event today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And what you have forgotten is we are consumed by or with supply chain problems right at the moment. So it's really, yeah, it's the best time to deal with the problems of supply chains. And I would skip one word in the title of the ICC forum, the future of international supply chains. It's even more right now the reality and the presence of the supply chain. So there are many problems outside there, but this later on. It's great pleasure to welcome you here at the House of German Business, Haus der Deutschen Wirtschaft in Berlin. Yeah, and some people here in the room that's quite new, and it's refreshing for me to see and speak people in person. But nevertheless, welcome to all of you, the participants and the speakers here today. International supply chains have been and are still under as much pressure as never, or at least since World War II, I would say. Shortages of containers, traffic jams of containers, skyrocketing freight rates, supply shortages due to a high global demand. That's a good thing. But also due to an ongoing corona pandemic, make it really hard for companies to run their business. That leads to the fact that many companies cannot produce as much as they would like because they are not getting enough raw materials, intermediates, supply goods. The famous goods are the semiconductors. The gap between incoming orders and the actual production has never been so high here in Germany in history. On top of that, the increase of trade barriers we have seen in recent years, not to mention the outgoing or the policy of the former US administration. There was one president who very much was referred to trade barriers and new customs duties. We see many other challenges in the near future. There are demands from civil society to disclose your knowledge of business knowledge when it comes to their supply chains, when it comes to their supplier, sometimes when it comes to their supplier of the supplier and the other supplier when you think down or upstream. Never mind. There are new compliance obligations. There is the trend of digitalization also in the supply chains. There is the big trend of what in the financial industry is called ESG. Our surveys show that 4 out of 5 companies are affected by current supply shortages and difficulties and price increases. A quarter of them had to decrease and still has to decrease its production or even had to stop it due to missing materials and components. And one very prominent sector is the car industry. The majority believes the situation will improve, not this year, but at least in the course of next years. But further challenges remain, once again, ESG sustainability. So with this in mind, I also look forward to discussing the opposite view of our panel. So let's turn it around. How can we achieve more trade again and not less? And what role does the European Union play in general, but also with respect to Asia and North America? Hence, I'm happy to have such a great group of experts here today to discuss the topic, the new world trade order, impact on international supply chains. And I would like to come here on stage Simone Menne. She's president of the AmCham Germany, and not only, by the way, this member of the supervisory board of Deutsche Post DHL group. Welcome, Simone Menne. We have Dr. Holger Bingmann. He is the chairman of the ICC Germany. So he is our boss, Oliver, and my boss here in his capacity of chairman the ICC Germany. We have Dr. Christian Vorwig. Where is he? Please come on stage. He is head of the sub-department for Foreign Economic Policy, Trade Policy America at the BMWE, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. And we have virtually, we've seen him now many minutes here on the screen already, as Jürgen Lindenberg, Managing Director and co-owner of Linde, a typical representative of what makes the German national economy strong. It's the Mittelstand, the SME sector, and he is vice president of CCI of Rhein-Neckar Mannheim, and member, by the way, of the DIHK Foreign Trade Committee, and also member of the ICC Germany Presidium. Now, let's dive into the topic, and I would propose to start with, does it work? Perfect. With Jürgen Lindenberg, with the view of a businessman, of a practitioner, so to say. Your company Linde provides digital solutions and products. You're also active on the Chinese markets. When it comes to supply chain shortages, where does the shoe pinch? Wo drückt der Schuh? Does the shoe pinch?
The shoe.
Floor is yours.
First, welcome. I was just interrupted for a minute or so I didn't hear the welcome. But welcome to everyone. Sorry I can't be in Berlin today, but I will be in Berlin next week. So it was just a little bit much traveling. The shoe pinches the most because the supply chain is unpredictable. We cannot tell our customers precisely when they can get the ordered products. It starts with the unpredictability of the factories in China who cannot tell us anymore how long it will take to produce our products. It continues with that our own logistic hub in Ningbo in China cannot tell us when they will be able to get a container that's being shipped to Hamburg. It continues with once the container is there and filled, we don't know which ship it will take. Once it's in Hamburg, we don't know when it will be brought to Mannheim because of the lack of trucks and truck drivers, and so on and so on. And we just cannot tell our customers when they can get their orders, and that is very bad. We are used to be in the interface between a long time we need to pre-order products, while our customers want to have the products in a short time, mainly next day delivery. And that makes our business at the moment very difficult.
Jürgen, do you think, or do you rethink your international engagement? Are you searching for new suppliers in some other markets or providers?
We would do so, but the products we have are almost exclusively made in China or by Chinese factories in other Asian countries, and they in Vietnam, for example. But they also depend on products or material coming from China to finish the products there. So at the moment, we have no choice. And the question is whether it is better if the products come from other countries, because the shortage of containers and shipping capacity is worldwide.
Okay, thank you very much for giving us these aspects of the current turmoil when it comes to international logistics and the supply chains. Simone Menne, you keep a close look to the relations, the trade relations, not only the trade relations between the United States and Europe, Germany. So after the presidency of Donald Trump, I guess you also hoped for an easing of trade conflicts. What are your observations now and your experience with the new administration when it comes to trade policy?
Well, there are several aspects, and of course, for AmCham Germany, it is absolutely essential that trade is open, that we have level playing fields, and that goes also towards other countries like China, and that tariffs are released and make trade as easy globally as possible. What we see is that there is not so much change. There is a different tone, which is very helpful. And there is some optimism in our membership because we see that stepwise there is a behavior to look for solutions. So let's take the airline penalties, where we have a moratorium now. There was the steel and aluminium tariffs, where at least we have till year end. Hopefully, there's either a solution or a further moratorium. So at least there are no real solutions. There is not an easy, oh yes, we give you everything. But we see that both sides want solutions, and even when there is the say America first, we also see that Biden administration knows very well about global trade and the importance of Europe and Germany within the trade. So it's not easy, it's not solved. There are different aspects where we want to work on solutions, but it is also not totally stuck. So it is a progress, but not a rising sun yet.
That leads me immediately to Christian Vorwig, because he's part of the machinery, so to say, in the discussion between European Union and United States. One keyword or one new institution is the Trade and Technology Council, which has taken place, I guess, a fortnight ago or like this. Do you share the view of Simone Menne? A decent optimism, I would say.
A decent, yeah, it's working. Yeah. Good morning. Yes. Well, yes. In general, yes. I share this, and perhaps to highlight is from our perspective a little bit. When we look at the bilateral relations with the United States, I think there is some improvement. Although we were not surprised with the Democrats now in office. It's the Democrats traditionally are the free traders in the U.S. part. This was more in the past the Republican Party. This was that was looking for free trade. So we didn't expect a great move towards free trade. Nevertheless, what we see in our relations and in the EU relations with the new administration is a lot more openness. It's a lot more transparency. Is the willingness to really engage in serious talks. And the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, Volker just mentioned, is one of the examples where we see real progress. There is a lot of interest on both sides to make this a success. This is a working format with over 10 working groups, and there is a lot of engagement in all of these parts, especially with regard to supply chains, also with regard to new standards. Think of artificial intelligence and other things. And and finally, perhaps I can add here, we had very recent talks with the US last week at the margins of the G7 summit in London, where we met again with Catherine Tai. We met her several times already. And of course, the topic between our ministers is the trade relations and how to improve them. And we see from their part the serious commitment from the US to engage with us to solve problems. You mentioned Airbus, you mentioned the steel conflict. We are quite confident to have progress soon also in this area. So this is, well, slight optimism, yes.
Thank you, Christian, we were supposed to have Ignacio Bercero in our panel. I guess due to technical problems, maybe I have to step in to what I would have asked him, or where my position is. So or we go back to zero and start again. Yeah, if not to bother you, Christian, a bit, to say, okay, the world order with the leading country, United States, is at least undermined or stocks or has been eliminated. United States are much more than in former times following what we describe by American. And then we have had Donald Trump's, some would have said trade wars. And on the other side, the European Union started with a trade agenda, an open strategic autonomy. And I would like to stress, and this would have been the question to Ignacio Bercero, maybe Christian, do you think that's a new vicious circle to more protectionism?
No, definitely not. First, I would disagree with the point that the US is not longer a leading part in the trade game. I think it has been challenged. It has been challenged under the last administration. Of course, when the US threatened to withdraw from international organizations, from the multilateral approach. This has been corrected under the new Biden administration. At least there were several commitments to the multilateral system, being it the WTO or the OECD or whatever in trade. So the US definitely, in our view, wants to remain a leading player in the trade game. When it comes to the European Union, yes, there's the open strategic autonomy. That's the new trade agenda for the EU. And your question, is this a way to more protectionism? No, it's all of them. It's open, and that's very important from the German perspective. It's open markets. This is our priority. If not, the other strategic and autonomy doesn't work. So it's all three of these issues today together. It's strategic because we have to be aware that we cannot be always confident to leave those difficult questions to one big partner and just follow what they do. We have our own position. We have an own position in trade. We have own interests, and these interests differ from the United States and they differ from China. And we have a different position between China and the United States. So this is why we have to be strategic. And we have to be, to a certain degree, autonomous as well. And this is a discussion still going on. Up to what degree do we have to be autonomous as Europeans here? There are instruments to be developed. We have, for example, now the so-called anti-coercion instrument in the pipeline of legislation. And we have indeed to assess how far we want to have an own autonomous policy here, autonomous instruments. And in our view, we have to be realistic here. We have to follow, first of all, the rules we have in the multilateral rules we have in the world, the WTO rule book and the trade rule book, including the bilateral agreements we all have. And we have to be aware of our own capacities, or our own economic capacities. What can we really achieve here? What is realistic, and what is perhaps too far away from reality?
And allow me one thing, the US is still by far the biggest trade partner for Germany and for Europe. There cannot be any doubt that it will be a major trade partner for years and years and years going on. We have, and I totally agree to you, we have to take our own stand. We were very comfortable in relying on, okay, the US will do it. And they are asking us now, us as Europe, also to take a certain position, which is just fair. And I understand Biden when he says, I have to take care also about American voters. He has an internal issue. He has to also satisfy the steel workers. So he cannot easily say, oh, I make it easy for the Europeans, because then he will lose voters. And we have the same here. We talk about internal automotive industry during our election and not so much about what are we doing in the world. So I don't see this America is not a major player again. On the other hand, I see the crisis we are having in supply chain with the containers and cargo and production, as well as this challenge decoupling US and China may be. This crisis could be an opportunity for Europe, because we have to take our stand and we have to find together.
Thank you. So we really dived in a bit in the conflicts. I guess it's good to veil up or to disclose the conflicts. Decoupling is one key word. China is not only an elephant in the room. Holger Bingmann, your perspective is a multilateral one. You are the president of the German section, so to say, of a multilateral organization. Is it worth to sacrifice the trade relations with China due to what Simone Menne has said, that United States are a long-standing partner and maybe our major trading partner? When we compare trade volumes, it's even China that they are first, but when it comes to investments and services, then it's United States.
Thank you very much for raising that question. Let me first start by answering the question with a more general remark. Trade always brought people together. And if there's really one benefit apart from the economic side of trade, that if you want to trade with somebody, you need to talk to him. And so what we all do is raising the necessity of talking to each other. And I'm lucky that we are, what you mentioned, that we are now able to talk to our American friends again. I'm lucky that we have a system like the Außenhandelskammer throughout the world. I'm lucky to be chairing one in the Emirates, and I'm lucky to have an organization like the International Chamber of Commerce. Last year, it looked pretty much like as the Americans were blocking the necessary reforms of the WTO, that an organization like ours would be the only international organization that will still be the basics for working together economically. So now we are getting a little bit back to rules. And yes, of course, we need free trade, but we need some kind of rules or basics or a technical solution of how to do trade with each other. But then I come back to my point. Apart from this, it's talking to each other, and trade agreements are in this time no more only on trade. It's all about can we send our kids to the university in Singapore or in the UK, or how to bring each other closer to us. And I think that's one definitely basic necessity to keep in touch with each other, because the disruptions we are talking about, yes, we talked about supply chain. We did not mention the rise of the price augmentation in supply chains. I heard this morning from a former colleague from your company that chartering Boeing 747 around the Atlantic costed about $500,000 last year ago. It now costs about $2 million only for one flight and transport. So let's not forget the price situation. Second thing is we are in the middle of disruptions. We are just coming out of Corona. We have the decarbonization. We have the demographic aging. We have the digitalization that is maybe maybe the basic with some kind of block technology for the future to do an easy way of trade with each other. This is one thing that we are heavily on side of the International Chamber of Commerce working on. So there are all of these disruptions. Yes, I'm not the German entrepreneur only talking about disruption and blaming them and going back to Upper Bavaria and saying I'm lucky to be there and don't touch me. Yes, but the only way of addressing these opportunities or these disruptions is staying in touch with each other, and that's why these conferences. And I really like to hear, Oliver, from your side that we had nearly 1,000 participants in this. So it seemed to be an interesting format. The people want to stay in touch. The people want to discuss about it. If I hear from you the American point, if I hear the European standpoint in your double function as two speakers, so that's the amazing part. We need to ongoingly discuss and solve these problems with and not only claiming about it. So thank you.
Okay, I would like to ask you what your observations or what are your experience when it comes to the question. The WTO was built due to a common understanding or common wish that we all want to have a non-discriminatory, a fair, rule-based system of how we interact economically worldwide. And there was not the one big player who did things at the expense of the others. What we are observing is local content rules, for instance, United States in the new NAFTA, the USMCA agreement, which is conflicting WTO rules, and which is not what we all after Second World War, when the WTO or the predecessing institution was built. So honestly, is there a common denominator, Holger, in your talks with other business people, that they are really working on what we once have been agreed on?
Absolutely, fully agree on what you mentioned, Volker. Yes, we are living in a system of after Second World War regulations, and yes, we need to update this. And I think that the new presidency of WTO is a very good signal. The American support is a very good signal. The Europeans they can't even think of an alternative to further ongoing reformation of the WTO with all the problems they had in the past. So I think it's an absolute clear signal to do trade with each other. Yes, but on the other hand, each of us, each of an entrepreneur in that situation needs maybe to revise a little bit his past. Didn't we go too far in cutting down our stocks to 0.1% as Ignacio, I don't remember the rest of his name, claimed us 25 years at Volkswagen, and we all did this, and we were relying on the supply chain. Yes, didn't we make a little mistake? If you look on the market for screws, then it gets complicated. Screws mostly are manufactured in China and in Italy. Through Corona, both of these countries. So the screw industry did already some diversification, but unfortunately with the wrong country. So we have to revise these production facilities and our stock. And of course, there are some goods, as we learned through Corona, which must be maybe managed, centralized to keep our health stable.
I think there are several issues. One is that the shipping industry was condensated to very few shipping lines. So that was for a period of time quite good, but it was only good when you had a seamless process, and that was disrupted. And now this disruption still has I think 9% of the cargo capacity is stuck on ships at the moment. Yeah, so this is a very special situation. And yes, just-in-time production was very comfortable for the companies, and maybe Jürgen can also tell us a little bit about it. And I think that will be reconsidered without saying I produce everything nationally, because that doesn't make sense. We all believe, I think, in global supply chains and in global production. And there we come to the WTO. I think everybody would agree that we need a WTO, except maybe some political leaders who think very national. But in general, everybody will participate and everybody will benefit from a good level playing field globally. And that is valid for Russia, that is valid for all Asian countries, for India, for Brazil. And therefore, they all need it, because we cannot negotiate with every country and have a special rule for every country or talk with every country about sanctions. That would be disaster. And every trader in the world, I think, will definitely say, yes, this is why we need to reform the WTO.
But Simone Menek, could you give us an idea why the United States are blocking to recruit the appellate body at the WTO? And we all know that the appellate body is very important for functioning of the WTO.
Well, I think the problem at the moment in the US is the conflict between Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans are blocking ambassadors, they are blocking several candidates, and they just do it to blackmail. And that is a real issue. Yeah, and this is not because people in the Biden administration don't think that a reform of the WTO is necessary. At least that would not be my impression.
Jürgen, you're an expert on China, or on having problems now, right at the moment with China. And there are not only a few people here in Germany and Europe who say we have to follow the United States in reconsidering the importance of China for our supply chains. Do you follow them, or what do you answer? Do you think it makes sense to bring back added value, what you right at the moment are getting from China to Europe or to Germany, maybe incentivized by taxpayers' money? What's your take on that?
I didn't quite understand the question, because the first part of the question was different than the second.
My question is, what do you answer the people who say we have to reconsider our dependency on China, that we bring back production from China to Europe, to Germany, by, for instance, subsidizing? There are several proposals also in some coalitions, supposed coalition partners, parties.
We are dependent on supplies from China in many ways, not only in smartphones or high-tech products, but for example, the products we sell is our bread and butter products are cable, connection cables that every one of you has on his desk between computers and monitors, etc. There is simply no other source in the world for such an easy product. And if I had to start a factory for cables in, let's say, Poland or Romania, where the cost of labor is also relatively cheap, I would have to employ Chinese engineers to help me start up these factories, because simply the know-how outside China does not exist anymore. And that has to be reconsidered in aspects of supply chain. When the supply chain, the transportation becomes more and more expensive, then we have to reconsider this, regardless of whoever is in power in China.
Thank you. That's a clear answer. Thank you for that one. One further question to your short-term problems you might have, and you explained before, are you able to roll over your cost increases and supply problems to your customers?
Little bit of funny story. Yes, we increased our prices 2 weeks ago in general just by 4% increase. Reaction of many customers, only 4%?
Okay. Holger Bingmann.
If I like to add one.
Yeah. Our sales manager answered that if you want to pay more, we are happy.
It's not always easy with this pricing. I had a funny happening yesterday in an Italian restaurant here, who is famous for its pizza with truffle. And ordering this yesterday, they mentioned it is stopped because truffle became so expensive last week, and they can't double the price on it. But this brings me once again to the point that you mentioned also, we have to look maybe for other supply chains in the side. I'm frequently in the Arabian countries, which really put a strong impression on myself that they are really interested in doing more with us. So, and the second thing is, why don't we source a little bit more in Europe? Didn't we maybe look in the past 10, 20 years more having a family home in Mallorca than instead of working with a Spanish company? Yes, maybe taking into account what happens now that the prices are higher there, but we have some kind of reliability. And one of my eldest joint venture I have with a Swedish company since 35 years. I rely on these people. Yes, they are more expensive. Yes, but they function. So we should have a look for alternatives, because the price augmentation comes anyhow by transport, by availability, by price rises from the products. So that's exactly the moment to look around where are alternative sourcing channels.
And isn't it a very normal discussion? You know, you have developments where everything goes fine, prices went down for a lot of things, electronics, whatever. We were in a very comfortable state. But now we see, okay, it doesn't work anymore, prices go up, we look for new sources for the same price, but maybe closer. We have the ESG targets you mentioned. So anyhow, we will look into more regional products for maybe food. So in this regard, I think we are just seeing a disruption which will be followed by a normalization. And these periods we regularly had. So I'm a little bit reluctant to scandalize it so much. And I think partly it can be healthy to have disruption and reconsider processes, ways of working together, and maybe also believe at the crisis is an opportunity to find new alliances.
I mean, we sitting here maybe relatively well equipped in terms of income, yeah, and looking at the purchase power of some others, higher prices, inflation leads to undermining the purchase power of many in Germany, but even more worldwide. So, but that's a different discussion, and it's a macroeconomic discussion. Me as an economist, I'm a bit scared about the expectation for the next maybe 2 or 3 years or maybe more, because this could lead or should lead from an economics perspective to higher interest rates. And then we all know that's a different macroeconomic framework when we think about investments and the business cycle in general.
Now you're opening the discussion for everything, yeah?
Yeah.
So basis salary, or what are we doing with taxes, and finally what is happening with interest rates and inflation.
But your point is, you're not scared about the disruptions or the relocations or diversification, to put it mildly, in international division of labor. Some say we are some say the doomsday supporters say we are at the end of the globalization. I would say at least it's a reshaping of international division of labor, what we experience right now, and could lead, and one side aspect, and it's not only a side aspect, are an increase in prices, which is a distributional matter, and we have to put this on another panel. Yeah, but when it comes to the international division of labor, so you don't share my view.
I strongly believe in globalization still. I think we also have to take into account the development of technology, where some work will not be done anymore by people. That therefore, of course, there is a scarcity at the moment in good people, but that makes work and labor more valuable, and that is a good point, I would say, for people in general. If we value the labor as such, what kind of labor ever, and if we, like we did during the Corona crisis, value the work of nurses, now we value the work of truck drivers. These are labor which was never valued before, and in this regard, that could be a good development. And yes, it may come to a point that part of our system has to be renewed, but that doesn't mean that we don't have globalization and that we are not making trade with China or with the US or with Russia, as long as we have a level playing field and as long that they keep human rights. I think that is important, that we have to keep these rules. And then we work on standards, like we just heard. And if we develop standards for data or standards for certain goods, then there's no meaning why we should not have further globalization.
Thank you very much. We have now Ignacio Bercero in the call and here on the panel. Ignacio, I do hope that you can hear us.
I can hear you. I'm very sorry about not having been able to connect earlier. There was some technical incompatibilities, but I have been able to listen to the webinar so far. So if you have any question for me, I can still answer.
Yeah, we have so many. We have too many questions for you. We just discussed the future of international division of labor, or not only labor. Yeah, the globalization in general. There are some threats, short-term threats, longer terms. The WTO is some say, I would say, is a standstill. So when it comes to the rules for the globalization, the WTO, what's your outlook, thinking of the next ministerial conference taking place starting in December in Geneva?
Yeah, no, I think that obviously the challenge of getting to a positive outcome in the ministerial conference at the end of this month is quite significant. We have many differences of views to reconcile. From our point of view, I think that we should basically aim at two things. First, I think we need to be able to reach some confidence building steps, some signals that the WTO is delivering, is actually relevant for the challenges of the global economy. That's why it would be so important to reach an agreement on the different aspects relating to the impact of the COVID-19 on the trading system. So the trade and health discussion is going to be extremely important. We have, of course, some very difficult issues to consider, like the elements relating to intellectual property, but we hope we will be able to reach a consensual outcome that looks into the different aspects on trade and health. On the whole question of WTO reform, what I think will be critical will be to be able to start a process. I mean, it's clear that there is challenges on the three core functions of the WTO. There's challenges on the WTO as a negotiating forum. There's a need to improve the capacity of the WTO to monitor And of course, we need to find a way forward to restore a functioning dispute settlement system. This is of critical importance if we wanted to have respect for the rules, which has been a cornerstone for the global economy. Now, our hope is that we will be able to agree in the ministerial meeting on a work program that allow us to look into how to improve the functioning of the negotiating, monitoring function of the WTO, and also to engage on reforms of WTO dispute settlement. So that, I think, is the perspective that we are bringing towards NC12. Obviously, there are other issues that we need to see how we can tackle. I mean, ideally, it would be very good if we could actually conclude negotiations on a fisheries subsidies agreement. It's a negotiation which has been going on for a very long time. At the same time, it's a very challenging negotiation because you need to tackle three of the most difficult issues for a multilateral negotiation. You need to tackle subsidies, you need to tackle sustainability, and you need to see how to tackle the issue of special and differential treatment of developing countries. So I think there is still important difference outstanding. But of course, ideally, it would be good if we could also conclude the negotiations on fisheries subsidies. But I would say the critical question is, can we actually get to a meaningful outcome on the trade and health discussion? And can we set up a process towards reform of the WTO that looks holistically into the three core functions, very much with the perspective that between now and the next ministerial meeting, we should find a way forward to have again a functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. I mean, that's very important because if you don't have a functioning dispute settlement system, inevitably what you're going to see is erosion of respect for the rules. And respect for the rules of the WTO has been vital cornerstone for the global economy. And if we were actually going to see a system in which the rules are no longer respected, that they are systematically ignored, I think this would obviously be very detrimental for our prosperity and very detrimental for the stability, which is so critical for business. So that's why I think there's a lot of important issues at stake, but at the same time, it's certainly not going to be easy to find a resolution of those questions.
Thank you, Ignacio. Time is proceeding, and that leads me to raise my final question. And I start with you, Ignacio. We have here Christian Vorwig. He will remain a very important player in the German, also in the new German government, I'm quite sure, because he's really our great trade expert. When it comes to the new German government, what are your wishes in supporting the European open the open strategic autonomy trade policy and also your policy when it comes to the WTO, Ignacio?
Well, first I have to say that I was really very impressed by the very eloquent way in which Christian had been defining the concept of open strategic autonomy. I could not certainly have done it any better than that. So I'm very, very relaxed that as long as Christian is playing an important role in the German administration, that we will be able to cooperate very well with the German government. Now, this is going to be a very challenging time for trade policy. It is clearly the most difficult environment for trade policy that I remember in the many years I have been working for the European Commission. So having the German government, which is strongly committed towards trade openness, which is strongly committed towards multilateralism, that of course also supports the bilateral trade agenda. We should not forget that we are engaged in a number of important bilateral negotiations and that are important agreements that will have to go through the ratification procedure. That's also important for the credibility of our trade policy. That is very committed to sustainability. I think it's clear that trade policy would need to be able to make a contribution towards the climate transition, but at the same time, it fully understands that you cannot actually have sustainability without at the same time having openness. So all in all, I'm confident that the new German government will continue to be playing an important role in driving a trade policy agenda within the European Union, which is committed towards openness, which is, I think, is a fundamental value for our trade policy.
He is a director at the Directorate General of Trade, the DG Trade, live from Brussels. Sorry for the inconvenience when it comes to the technical equipment. Simone Menne, we have not mentioned the Green Deal. We've mentioned just ESG in general, but the Green Deal and the supposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is nothing less than an import tariff, could be. So having this in mind, what are your wishes? What are your expectations when it comes to the new coalition, the Jamaica? No, it's not Jamaica. It's the traffic light coalition. No,
yeah.
it's not Jamaica. So this was maybe wishful thinking.
all three parties who are negotiating at the moment are in favor of multilateralism and open trade. So that is already a good prerequisite. We as AmCham definitely hope, when we talk about the Green Deal, that we talk more towards a direction of a climate club, because it would not be good to have a European trading border where it makes it difficult and maybe European products, European energy more expensive, with imports then coming from low-cost energy countries or from the wrong sources. So that is a very complicated issue. I think the topic of energy and trading will be a very, very important one for the new government. And I don't think that they have a solution at the moment. Of course, the new government is very dependent from the European ideas. And I, as president of the AmCham, would hope that climate solutions together with the US would be a really powerful way to globally have an impact on energy and energy trading. And that would be my wish if I talk to the new government.
Thank you very much. Holger Bingmann, the new government, the last government, we had excellent people working there like Christian Vorwig, but some plans were failed. Thinking about an European Union Mercosur FTA, thinking of the ratification of the comprehensive agreement on investment with China.
Absolutely.
Having this in mind, what are your expectations or wishes? Maybe there's a discrepancy between.
The wishes are getting closer to Christmas. Yes. Wishes, of course, is a stronger European feeling. You mentioned this. It can't happen that we celebrate Mercosur and then there's one country which I really like at the border of us who is blocking us because of its agricultural interest. And this is definitely the major problem of Europe, which is a hard problem to solve. If we look at Poland and Hungary for the moment, how to keep them inside our box and not driving them outside of our box, which would be a bad signal after the Brexit again. My hope, which I explained this morning, that was a little bit later. I had the lucky of being at the Liberal Party and talking to the head of the economics group this morning, and my hope for German entrepreneurs is a little bit, let's have a look on the tax system inside Europe. We in Germany, we live with a tax system of 2008, and We were definitely all hopeful that the new government might touch this in a more positive way compared to the countries around us. For the moment, it seems to be okay if there's nothing happening, not raising, not coming down, but taxes is difficult for the near future. And of course, the energy costs help us. However, energy costs will be changing something. Yes, and it is an opportunity, not driving an SUV alone throughout the city. Yes, it needs to be another future there. But on the other hand, if you look at on the company side, the energy costs are dramatically. So my two wishes, if I look on Germany, is taxes, energy costs. My wish on a closer look would be let's stay together in Europe and maybe look for old and new friends around.
Thank you, Christian. I don't ask you for your wishes, your personal wishes, but I ask you for your expectation. What might be of the highest three major priorities when it comes to trade policy of the new government?
Well, the major challenge will be that the new government, of course, the new minister coming into place and in charge for trade policy has an open mind towards trade policy, and what we will certainly do as myself, being part of the administrative body here, not on the political side, is try to explain and to convince the new government why trade policy issues are so important and why a comprehensive trade agenda, as described by Ignacio with the WTO, but also with the bilateral agenda with agreements as Mercosur and others, are so important for Germany and for Europe. And this is I think our task to do, and my expectations or my deep conviction is that we need a government that really sees the challenges there, but also the chances we need and we should pursue as a German government to pursue our interests with regard to trade policy. And there is where several aspects, of course, come new to the trade agenda, as mentioned here before in the discussion. It is not only about globalization. It's other issues coming in. It's environment, it's sustainability, it's climate policy, it's everything. It's not only one or two countries blocking this in the EU. It's a whole big discussion going on, and it's our part or our task to take part in this discussion and to play our role and to try to convince our partners together with our colleagues in the European Commission, where we definitely work very close together and are pulling on the same string. Yeah, so this would be my expectation for the new government.
Thank you. And we started with the representative of German Mittelstand, and we are closing with him. Jürgen, from your perspective, so to say, as a practitioner, having in mind all the paperwork you have to do and might be some other obligations. We've discussed about ESG and disclosure policy in your supply chain. What are your wishes? Now, please, think about it's Christmas, and now you do want to have some presents, some gifts from the new government.
Well, apart from the paperwork, where the governments in this world shift more and more work that they should be doing to the companies, my biggest wish is being able to travel as in 2019 again.
Hey, that's also a statement, yeah? This is where the shoe pinches. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
For everybody, and I do want to apologize for overstretching the time, but from my perspective, it was very interesting. Thank you to a wonderful panel. I have to hand over 5 minutes to a 5 minutes break. Okay, that's also wonderful. And then we start. Then we will have Marion Jansen. Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. And then we hear how governments can contribute to resilient supply chains. Thank you very much. Goodbye, Ignacio, to Brussels and everybody.
Hello and welcome back to our workshop, Tomorrow's Supply Chains, here at the House of German Business in Berlin. My name is Melanie Vogelbach. I'm the Managing Director for International Economic Policy here at DIHK, and I'm taking over as moderator from Volker Treyer for the next part of our event. We just had a very interesting discussion with a very distinguished panel on the huge challenges that businesses face at the moment in their international supply chains. We looked into various aspects of this issue, on the situation of businesses to the activities of governments and the concept of open strategic autonomy. One major aspect of the discussion was the role that government can play and how they can help businesses in this situation. And that's one aspect that we would like to look into a little bit further in our next segment. Hence, I am very happy to introduce our next expert, Dr. Marion Jansen. Hello, Ms. Jansen. She is Director for Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. And before joining OECD, she held several senior positions at the World Trade Organizations, the International Labour Organization, and the International Trade Center. So she, you can really say that she is an expert on all matters of international trade, and she really knows what challenges businesses face in this very moment. Ms. Jansen, OECD recently published a very timely study on the resilience of supply chains. You looked into the question which factors were relevant for the supply shortages that we saw in recent months during the corona crisis, and whether they happened due to the international supply chains or whether the fact that we do have these international interconnected supply chains was actually also a factor that was beneficial during the crisis. And you looked into the role of government. So we very much look forward to the next part of our event, to your presentation, and to hear about the findings you had during your studies. So I'll hand it over to you for the presentation, The Future of International Trade, How Can Governments Contribute to Resilient Supply Chains?
Thank you very much, Melanie. Thank you very much for having me with you today. Let me first do a tech check. Do you hear me, Melanie? I cannot hear you reply. Do you hear me? Well, I assume that you hear me and you see me. And I will now start my presentation then. So thank you very much for having me with you today, Melanie. Indeed, I've been in the business for trade for quite some time, over 20 years now. That says something about my age, unfortunately, but nevertheless, notwithstanding these decades of experience, I can tell you that I'm perceiving this period as really extraordinary when it comes to the frequency of changes we are witnessing, and also to the size of the shocks our economies have to deal with. So we at the OECD, like many other players in the economy, like governments, but also the business people that you have been speaking to in the session before, we are having to adjust. We are having to adjust rapidly in order to maintain relevant for policymakers and to help them to deal with this particular situation we are currently facing. And these adjustments also require that since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, we have been looking in different ways and at different aspects of value chains in order to try and help policymakers in their decision-making process. The discussion you are having here today is very timely. We are, and as you heard already in the previous session, in many places of the world and definitely among many of the OECD member countries experiencing supply chain problems, supply chain bottlenecks, and they are leading to shortages in many parts of the economy. The semiconductor shortage is nearly becoming legendary already, but also the of other products. I'm thinking here of production materials. We are now needing the delivery times that are double of the delivery times that we were facing before the COVID-19 crisis. And this is the case even so in most places of the world. Production is up again, trade is happening again, but the change in the level of demand and the change in the composition of demand is such that we are nevertheless not managing to meet the demand that we are facing. As a result, prices are in many places going up, notably in Germany. According to my information, your average price increase in August when compared to the previous year is around 12%, but for some products, prices have nearly doubled. Growth forecasts are being affected in many countries, including in Germany. A recent forecast has downgraded the growth expectations for Germany from 3.7 to 2.4%. So this is non-trivial business. These are rather serious problems we are facing. And the question is how to deal with this. One of the things that has happened is that there is an increased call to policymakers to do something in order to address the situation, and that do something takes sometimes the form of a request for governments to help and make supply chains more resilient. Now, that's now a rather current demand, but a few years ago we would have considered that a very unusual request. Supply chain management is something that was firmly in the hand of private business. They have supply chain managers who have been educated to do this. And definitely since the global financial crisis, many global businesses have quite complex, sophisticated supply chain management systems in place that also are able to deal with crisis situations. Now, also before the crisis, we had a situation where it was rather not desired for the government to intervene in private business. And we do know that if the government does this in an inappropriate way, this would be considered a distortion of competition, something that we don't like to see at the WTO or in a context where we are supposed to compete with each other freely and in a non-discriminatory way. But nevertheless, even so, business has experience in managing supply chains. Even so, we do know that government interventions in the private economy can end up being distortive and therefore creating problems with our neighbors. Nevertheless, the call for government intervention to help supply chains to become more resilient exists. It is probably also it's something that makes sense in the current context, and it's something that at the OECD we take very seriously. So what I'm going to do in the coming minutes is to give you an overview, a sense of where we think currently problems lie in supply chains. And then I'm going to tell you how we are trying to help policymakers to address this, to help supply chains to become more resilient, but to do this in a way that allows them to be not too discriminatory and also to work with the private sector rather than against the private sector. So let me start with the first thing, what is going on? And in order to do this, I will try to show you a few slides if I manage to handle the technology. So if somebody can tell me whether you see the slides, I would appreciate, but I simply assume that you do see my slides. I will show only 3 slides. This is the first slide. This slide is supposed to tell you something about the composition of trade. Now you're going to tell me those slides, and on these slides, the letters are so small, the font is so small, there's nothing I can see. Now I'm going to tell you, don't try to read anything, just look at the shape of the charts. You see on your left a blue chart, and on your right, you should see an orange chart. And when you compare the shapes, what you see is that on the left, we see a situation where everything dropped, went to the left, and in a relatively homogeneous way. And on your right, you see much more heterogeneity. Some things go to the left and others to the right. What these charts show is whether trade in certain product categories decreased, that's the bars going to the left, or increased, bars go to the right. Now on the blue chart, you see what happened during the great financial crisis, 2008, 2009. On the orange chart, you see what happened during COVID-19. Now, when you compare these 2 slides, what you see is that there was much more difference in what happened across product categories in the COVID-19 crisis than during the global financial crisis. During the global financial crisis, everything dropped. And during the COVID-19 crisis, we saw trade in some products drop, in many products drop, sometimes very significantly, and in others increase. We saw trade in electronic equipment increase. We saw trade in chemicals and pharmaceuticals increase. We saw, for instance, trade in everything related to aircraft decrease quite dramatically, and that's related to one of the problems Jürgen Lindemann referred to. We are not traveling anymore, so no demand for aircrafts. So compared to the crisis, last crisis we have gone through, the changes in the composition of trade are much bigger than in the global financial crisis. The biggest changes in 1 year since World War II, we see in 1 year changes that we normally see only occurring over 5 years. That's about the composition of trade in terms of products. Now here we look at composition of trade in terms of who is exporting and who is importing. And that's relevant when we think of logistics chains, because if China is exporting more, it means that containers travel from China to Europe to the United States. And when Europe is exporting less or the United States, it means that less containers are traveling from Europe or from the United States to China. And this is exactly what has been happening in the recovery phase during COVID-19 and in the beginning of the recovery phase, notably because China started producing earlier on again. The lockdowns were shorter and were earlier than in Europe and the United States. What we see is that China has been able to increase its share of exports in the world, whereas that share has decreased for Europe and the United States. On the import side, that adjustment is not the same. China increased also its imports, but less dramatically, less stronger than on the export side. And this, if we see that kind of changes at the aggregate level, this shows you what will be happening in the container shipment world, where now containers indeed travel full from Asia to the United States and to Europe, and would be empty when they travel back. And that, of course, creates logistical problems. Here, I've so far been talking about merchandise trade. Here, very interesting chart I find regarding services trade. You see here gray China, you see in blue G7 countries. Now, what you see is in the dotted line, blue, you see merchandise trade. So trade has picked up again in G7 countries, has picked up earlier and in a bigger way in China. That's the dotted lines going up. And then you look at services trade China and services trade, the blue line G7, services trade for the G7 countries is significantly below the place where it was before the COVID-19 crisis. And the solid gray line, China services trade, is far above where it was before COVID-19. When you dig deeper and you look at what this services trade is, it's transport services for China, it's travel services in the G7 countries. And what this chart simply shows is that travel services, one of the major exports of G7 countries, has not picked up again as before the crisis, whereas merchandise trade has picked up, at least when it regarding exports from China, and with it transport services from China. So we see here a very different way in which trade has been evolving in different regions of the world. And now I try to stop sharing my screen, and you should now see me again. Now, these compositional changes of trade are rather important. And I think they are definitely one explanation why we are experiencing the difficulties that we are currently facing in the area of supply chain trade. Now, what does this mean for the future? That's the other difficulty. We don't really know. We are not fully recovered yet. The adjustment to the coming out of the COVID-19 blockage has not taken fully place yet. So we don't know how long that is going to take. Second, in some areas like services, trade, travel, there has been hardly any adjustment. Travel is not back to where it was. So that's another change that is still going to happen. Third, consumers may actually have changed their behavior and their consumption pattern permanently as they're coming out of this crisis. So there may be some changes that mean that we are not going to go back to the normal before COVID-19, but to somewhere else. That adjustment we cannot fully capture yet. And then last but not least, we are not fully sure what is going to happen on the policy side. That leads to an important level of uncertainty for companies. And this level of uncertainty they are having to factor in when they make their investment and their trading decisions. So that explains a little bit why I said at the beginning of my talk, we are in a situation of uncertainties and changes, level of uncertainties and changes that I don't remember to have witnessed during my career. And this also explains why at the OECD, we have started to use different methods now to help, to assist governments in managing this situation. Now, first, we are using, on top of the typical macro studies and long-term assessments that we are conducting, we are using the kind of nowcasting methods or short-term assessments of what is going on in trade that I've been using for the presentation right now. But also, as we continue to publish papers, as the ones you have mentioned just before, Melanie, we now have put at the disposal of our members and actually of the public at large an interactive web tool that we call the Keys for Resilient Supply Chains. And if you type OECD, you Google OECD Keys for Resilient Supply Chains, you will find that web tool. The web tool provides policymakers with a way to think about supply chain resilience. And we have been guided when designing this supply chain tool by a typical supply chain manager approach in a company, and also by the information we receive from consultations with the private sector. And the 4 keys, when you walk through this tool, you would see that we describe 4 keys that policymakers should think about when they want to work towards more resilience. We don't give definitive answers, but we provide you with a way of thinking about resilience. The first key refers to thinking about anticipation of risks. Think about what could be the next shock. Where could it hit? Could it be a climate shock that is global? Could it be a disaster that is local? Could it be a technology shock? What are the things you are expecting to happen? Here we think that consultations with the private sector can be a very useful instrument, because the private sector is in its own assessment also going through this exercise of trying to identify where risks lies. As the next step, you should assess how you want to minimize the exposure to risk. And that's a very national type of discussion where different governments, different countries may put different emphases, also depending to the exposure to risk they may consider to be facing. So here again, a reason why we just give steps for how to think about the problem rather than giving definitive answers. Here, one of the answers, however, is to make sure that whatever you want to do to minimize, be coherent. For instance, if you consider as a government that your producers should diversify the supplier side, get a source from more countries, make sure that you have a coherent trade policy with those countries in order for your private sector to be able to source, to diversify sourcing. You can't just tell them to do it. Build the coherent policy environment around it. Third key for more resilient supply chains is very important in this period of change and exposure to shocks, to build trust and to be perceived as a player who knows, even in these times of change, what is going on and how things have to move. And in order to achieve this, it is very important in our view to work with the private sector, to communicate clearly to the private sector, but also to understand, to discuss with the private sector what is possible in a period of crisis and what is not possible, how the private sector can help, or where the risk lie for a government to intervene in a disruptive way if the government makes the wrong steps. So strong coordination here, in our view, required with the private sector, learn from each other and work with each other in an appropriate way rather than doing this independently. And last but not least, a key that I care also personally about quite a bit, make sure that markets remain open this does not only imply that you continue to work with the WTO, with your partners on tariffs and on tariff reductions and on price-based instruments, but also consider working with partners on regulations, on norms and standards, on how they are set, but also on how they are certified and how they are controlled at the border. So we would ask here for more cooperation with partners abroad, with your partner countries, rather than less. Now, if you've listened carefully, I've used throughout these four keys 4 times the word co, actually even 5 times. I've referred to more consultations, more coherence, more coordination, better communication, and more cooperation. And this terminology we have borrowed from the private sector, from the consultations with our private sector partners that at the beginning of the crisis told us, Marion, we don't need less trade, we don't need more autarky, we don't need closed borders, we need more co's, more things together, more cooperation of the public sector with the private sector, and more cooperations across borders with our trading partners. We continue to believe at the OECD that this more cooperation going further hand in hand remains important also to periods of crisis where the cooperation may be a bit more difficult. But at the OECD, we stand ready to help during this exercise. I will stop here. I look forward to the discussion and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Marion Jansen for this very interesting presentation. I hope you can hear me now. Sorry for the technical difficulties earlier. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I thought it was very interesting to see how we now face bigger changes in supply chains and in trade and in different sectors of trade compared to the global financial crisis. With regards to the question how long this will take, actually with DIHK, my colleague Volker Dreyer mentioned it earlier, we surveyed many companies, German companies here in Germany, but also abroad. And from our findings, we believe that well into the next year, we will see certain disruption of the supply chains. But of course, as you also mentioned, there are also structural challenges that might even last longer. Thank you very much also for introducing this tool. I thought it was a very interesting approach to make governments think like businesses when it comes to the resilience of their own supply chains. So I encourage everybody in our audience to take a look at the tool. Maybe we can post the link of the OECD website that leads you directly to the tool here in our chat for our audience. Thank you so much for the presentation, Marion. I'm afraid we're a little bit later on in our event time schedule as we planned. So I would hand it directly over to our next panel, and we will post the link for our audience to take a further look into your study and the web tool. So thank you very much. To Marion Jansen, thank you and goodbye. And I'm handing it back over to Oliver Wieck for our final panel to talk about the future of trade digitization. So very interesting topic as well. And I'm handing it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Melanie. And hello and welcome back to our last panel. As Melanie said, on the future of trade digitalization. What is this workshop about? Foreign trade, and we all know that, contributes significantly to the prosperity of the society, not only in Germany. However, to ensure that this remains the case also in the future, the framework must be adopted continuously. And if there is one thing that not least Corona has made clear, it is the fact that the central key to economic recovery is unquestionably the digitalization of foreign trade. The use of electronic documents offers a great opportunity for comprehensive simplification, acceleration of international trade. Documents could be generated fully automatically, and a common and complete electronic data set could be created, managed, and used. The transparency and thus the quality of procedures of international trade could be increased, time requirements could be significantly reduced, and costs could be lowered, all at the same time. In doing so, the digitalization of foreign trade could significantly improve access to world market, particularly for medium-sized companies. At the political level, the British G7 presidency put a strong focus on digitalization. Last Friday, the digital and tech ministers of the 7 largest Western industrialized nations have agreed on common rules for digital trade that could liberalize hundreds of billions of pounds or euros worth of business. This is really great news, but before discussing the impacts of this agreement with our panel, let me briefly introduce our distinguished participants. To my right, we have Alexander Andreu. He's head of the WTO Digital Trade Negotiations in the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport at the Government of the United Kingdom. Thank you very much for being here. On my left, we have Harald Schön. He's the head of the unit Law of Commercial Transactions, Transport Law at the German Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection. Thank you very much for being with us today. We highly appreciate your participation. In a virtual format, we have on the one side Craig Burchell. He's Senior Vice President of Global Trade Affairs at Huawei, who's joining us from Shenzhen in China. Thank you very much for being with us. And last but not least, my colleague Chris Southworth, Secretary General of the ICC in the United Kingdom, who is joining us from London. Again, also thank you for being with us today. My first question goes to Alex. First of all, congratulations to, in my view, the great achievements during the British G7 presidency on digital trade, including the declaration of last Friday. In a supplementary document, the G7 also declared that unwarranted barriers to cross-border data flows should be addressed, as well as data protection, privacy, intellectual property protection, and security. Can you explain what further steps are now planned to establish common principles for cross-border data flows, and particularly for the highly controversial issues of data protection, privacy, intellectual property between the US and the EU?
I mean, this is, of course, the data flows issue is a very challenging one. And there are a number of different kind of forums and conversations in which those discussions are taking place. I mean, most notably at the World Trade Organization through the e-commerce negotiations, where there's obviously attempts there to set the kind of baseline rules for digital trade, but particularly on data flows. I think really when it came to the G7 presidency, there are obviously different aspects to this. So there's the kind of digital and technology track. So there we had the kind of ministerial declarations made in April this year, and then obviously the trade track, which then focusing more specifically on the kind of trade commitments on data flows. I think certainly from the kind of UK government side, there's a lot of excitement after what's been achieved, particularly through this kind of trade track. I think the challenge with the data conversation in some respects is to even have that conversation and bring the parties to the table. So here you have some kind of a framework to progress these discussions. I think you have a common basis where we can bring the US and the EU together in a room, and particularly when you apply that in the WTO context to say that, look, there really is a mandate for coming to some kind of common agreement and some kind of common standards, which I think from the kind of business community is really what is required, that there has to be that baseline set of rules for how data can move across border. And hopefully this is the starting point for kind of achieving that outcome.
Well, you already mentioned the WTO Joint Statement Initiative, and for all of you who are not so much experienced in this issue, since 2017, after the ministerial in Buenos Aires, over 80 members of the World Trade Organization are negotiating trade rules on electronic commerce under the so-called, as I said before, the Joint Statement Initiative. So do you expect that this declaration, this agreement within the G7 can give an impulse on these negotiations? And do you expect an immediate outcome at the ministerial at the end of this year?
So, I mean, yeah, just to manage expectations, I suppose in the first instance that the ministerial conference this year, I think it's clear that the e-commerce negotiations are not being focused on as one of the outcomes that we're driving towards at that ministerial conference. I think from the UK perspective, we're probably looking towards the next ministerial conference, so MC13, where we would really like to see an outcome from the e-commerce negotiations. I think also in part just to give that clear deadline, because otherwise with these things you could negotiate forever. And really, I mean, we were already getting quite good response on the kind of G7 digital trade principles, and we think really this can be a useful tool that we can come back to the table on certain issues with, push for kind of landing zones and consensus decisions.
Talking about expectations, the next G7 presidency will be in Germany. Unfortunately, we don't have a German government yet, but I'm sure you already have your expectations on the next presidency, G7 presidency.
I mean, from our side, you know, on the kind of pure digital side, so this is the digital and technology track, one of the kind of outcomes that we're very proud of there was this project on electronic transferable records. So this is the first time that policy area was introduced in the G7 context. And we really think that what was achieved this year, which is a kind of roadmap for reform on transferable records, is really the kind of, this is the absolute baseline. So there's 4 core pillars. You're removing the barriers to domestic use of transferable records. So this is a kind of domestic reform piece. There's an international socialization element that really we need to kind of promote these reforms internationally. Then there's also the kind of standards piece where are you ensuring that, you know, transaction data sets can be moved from system to system, and finally a kind of regulatory piece, identifying which areas of regulation might prevent or need to be kind of considered when we're transitioning to digital for these transactions. And I mean, my hope would be that this policy area could be kind of continued and built upon in the German presidency. If not, certainly from the UK side, we've got the kind of a follow-up working group, which is happening in November, which is to kind of reconvene the working level experts. And we would love to see, if nothing else, that working group kind of continue to progress, because we think the kind of information sharing that can happen in that group is very important to develop this area.
Thank you. Chris, according to an EC research which was published last week during your Trade and Integrity Week, the use of digital trade documents within the G7 could reduce transaction costs by 76% and could cut time it takes to complete a cross-border deal by up to 81%. Digitalization trade would drive SME growth, accelerate economic recovery from COVID. However, the reality is a completely different one. International trade still relies on billions of papers, documents, outdated laws, which are dating back to the 16th century. A common trade transaction involves up to 27 documents, can take 3 months to complete, and costs business up to 80,000 euro. An administrative nightmare that keeps costs prohibitive for SMEs. What is the ICC and what is ICC UK doing to accelerate reforms within the G7, G20, and beyond?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I mean, I think, you know, let's just remind ourselves, what are we trying to do here from the private sector? You know, we want a digitalized trade ecosystem, and note the language. We're not so much talking about paperless trade or specific elements of the digital trade ecosystem. We're talking about digitalizing the whole ecosystem. I think that's really important. How do we make that happen? We need harmonized laws. So to the points that Alex was picking up there, that we need, you know, legal reforms back home in national capitals to bring our legal systems up to date, and then to align our legal systems to the what they call the UNCITRAL model law and electronic transferable records. That's the international framework, effectively. Then we need to standardize the system, and we do that by creating open interoperable standards, and that's the role of the ICC Digital Standards Initiative. and that will connect all our hardware, our software, all our systems across governments and the private sector. And all of that will allow all the documents that we talk about, the 27, to be digitized and all that information to flow in digital form. And that's when you really reap the benefits of the 9 trillion in trade, increase in trade, and dramatic cuts in transaction times and costs. So, you know, the Digital Standards Initiative is really driving. This is the hub within ICC's family, based out of Singapore. They're overseeing all the work on standardization. There are 4 standards in place already, so we've got to build those standards into our systems, and then also overseeing the legal reform work under what will become a new legal reform board being set up right now.
Elaborate a bit more on the findings of the report which was published last week?
Yeah, the report's really interesting. So we published the UK business case in April, and that was the first time we put an economic value on digitizing these trade documents. What we haven't done at that point is look at it from an aggregated perspective. So thanks to, we've got Craig on the call here, on the event here, thanks to Huawei for funding that piece of work. But it's really important because it's the first time we were able to aggregate up and verify whether our assumptions for the UK were correct across a larger network of economies, and in this case, the largest economies. And then what we found in there is, you quoted the figures, so I won't go back through them. But I think, 1, it validated the figures. 2, we were able to present a sort of coherent picture, coherent narrative that we could present to the UK government as G7 president this year, but also follow that up with the German government next year to continue the momentum. And then we've got more reports coming in the pipeline where the figures are equally impressive, I have to say. They're not public yet, but they are coming and they are impressive. So we're now starting to get this consistent picture that the value of digitalizing the trade ecosystem is worth an awful lot of money, and it removes an awful lot of pain, particularly for SMEs, and allows that sort of a sense of inclusion to bring many more SMEs into the economy, bring down trade barriers, and then drive trade. And that, of course, that's extremely relevant in the context of the economic recovery.
Speaking about the German government, I now want to turn to Harald Schön. In April this year, the G7 members agreed to assess the obstacles in their respective national legislations that are preventing the use of electronic documents. Upon the proposal of the Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection, ICC Germany coordinated a joint statement from a total of 11 German business associations on the use of electronic documents in foreign trade. Fact is that although Germany has already created the prerequisites for the use of electronic transport documents back in 2013, they are still not being used by the business community. In our view, the use of electronic transport documents could be accelerated by defining in more detail the terms of the digital opening clauses that require interpretation, by explaining in detail of issuing the details of issuing, carrying, presenting, returning, and transferring, as well as subsequent entries as referred to in the ordinance authorizations, and by defining the minimum technical standards. Do you agree, and how do you think that the use of electronic documents could be accelerated in the German economy?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Wieck. Also, good morning to our remote participants. Well, it's always a problem for us really to identify what the real problems are. Why is the law not used, the legal infrastructure, so to speak, that we created for using electronic documents? Mr. Wieck pointed out these rules exist since 2013. Still, we don't see a large volume of electronic documents, or still we hear complaints that the law would not be sufficient. I must say I would be a bit optimistic, or put it in a more optimistic way. Even if we are using paper documents, it doesn't mean that trade isn't digitized, because we're not speaking about forms that somebody would fill in by hand, but in fact, the forms are pre-filled in, are printed using IT systems. They are all the fields in the boxes are populated automatically. And so, yeah, this is actually a large amount of digitization. So when we look at the paper consignment notes or paper bills of lading, what we see is a storage medium. So obviously, the businesses find that using paper as the storage medium to communicate information from one party to the other is the most easiest way at the moment. And so that would mean for me to change, to switch to purely electronic alternatives would mean that we clearly have to analyze what are the benefits of paper that obviously many businesses still see today. Obviously, they think it's still very, very easy to handle compared to a fully digital solution. And then once we know better about the motivation to still use paper, we can start thinking about what prevents us from switching to purely digital alternatives, and then also develop necessary standards, necessary IT. So it's digitalization is nothing which comes overnight. It has never come overnight there's no sector where it came overnight. So I think it's a big effort for everybody. We as the governments, I think the G7 governments have the role to provide a legal infrastructure for the use of electronic bills of lading. And that's why the German government is very thankful and welcomed the British initiative to talk about this issue in the G7 group. And we are, of course, also open to hear the concerns from businesses and from associations like the ICC when it comes to the legal infrastructure, whether there are any shortcomings or so.
Well, thank you very much. I think in our statement, we very much made clear that it's not an either or, that we either want to use paper documents or electronic documents, but that we need more clarification, more security on the aspect of how could an electronic document look like. And we are ready to start a dialogue with you within the new government on how these implementing regulation could look like, what could be the elements, what could be regulated in more detail to ease, let's say, the access for the business community, for the business sector, to use not only, let's say, electronic application form, but also to digitalize trade documents in more general terms. But only in doing this, we will, in the end, come up with all these very interesting figures on cost reduction and time reduction. And that is certainly something which the German exporters, the logistic companies, the transport companies, and everyone, manufacturing industry, has in mind when they think about the digitalization of trade. But in one thing, you're absolutely right. We are not on an island, neither in Germany nor within the G7. And we all know that there are additional activities going on the one hand, on the European level, and we will come back to the Asian aspect in a moment. And I want to ask you another question concerning the EFTI regulation, which stipulates the creation of electronic platform for the exchange of information between the private and public parties from 2024 onwards. Only in this way, in our view, it will be possible to comprehensively digitalize foreign trade and not just reproduce the analog world by creating 10 different platforms, replacing 10 different documents. Can you elaborate in more detail what the current status of this European process is, and if there are any initiatives to move from a multi-window to a single window approach?
Sorry, what was the last?
if there's any activities or initiatives to move from a multi-window to a single window approach with regard to the platforms.
Okay. Yes, I must say that the FT regulation is not my field of responsibility, because the FT regulation concerns the B2A communication, so businesses to administration. It's about communicating, making available in an electronic form information that shows compliance with certain rules, let's say dangerous goods rules, rules on cabotage, and so on. The regulation has been adopted in 2020, the EU regulation, and the approach of that regulation is that it does not establish a single provider that everybody must, that all businesses need to communicate their information, but the regulation defines a product, you could say, the product of an FT platform. And any IT company could, let's say, develop a system which complies with the specification for an FT platform and could offer this product on the market, and then the companies could choose from a provider and make available their data on that platform or through that platform to the authorities. So it's indeed a multi-window approach, and that will not change, because that's seen as really a major advantage to other approaches, especially to a centralized approach. It's technically, it's probably more demanding, but it avoids the how you could say the accumulation of commercially sensitive data, because there will not be the one point where all commercial data will be stored in one IT system. That's also important, of course, for the businesses when it comes to confidentiality. And so, you could imagine that a bit like email. You could. I mean, everybody of us has an email account, but still there's no central email system. But there's a standard how email servers work, and an email finds its way from the sender to the recipient, and that's a bit like the FT system is designed. And I think this could maybe also be a way forward for the civil law documents like the Bill of Lading, that standards are developed, and then several providers can develop products that are in line with their standards, are interoperable, and so there's competition on the market, there's no lock-in effect, and so on.
That is exactly also the idea of the ICC Digital Trade Standards Initiative, that they try not to develop its own global standard, but they want to achieve and make possible the interconnectivity of the various standards which already exist and make them compliant. Turning to you, Craig, the COVID-19 pandemic has made, thank you very much, Harald Schön. The COVID-19 pandemic has made one thing clear: governments that put digitalization at the heart of their economic and trade policy will have a competitive advantage over those who do not. Therefore, unlocking the potential of digital trade is key to future global health, prosperity, and stability. In your view, has the international community done enough to address the digital economy? And can you tell us which initiatives are currently underway in Asia to further advance the digitalization of trade?
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's great to see you again. We spent many years in Business Europe. I was 20 years as Philips chief trade lawyer and represented the Dutch, so it's great to see you again. On the, I think the importance of multilateral collaboration can't be overstated. And I made some notes here because Marian Janssen stressed the importance of more cooperation. I think that's absolutely right. I spent all my career in the technology sector for Philips and Samsung and now Huawei. And I see Huawei as a product of globalization and globalized supply chains in the technology sector, the product of the ITA, etc., and globalization. I think digital trade offers huge possibilities, many golden opportunities for collaboration right across the globe. But I think that need for greater collaboration needs to be focused on new rules. And that's why I was very happy to support the funding of the 3 reports of the ICC on the business case for digital documents, which is one part of it. Of course, working on the multilateral level is challenging at the moment, very challenging. It took us, I was involved in the ITA agreement, which is a fabulous piece of global collaboration that's delivered a smartphone to billions of people. So it is possible where there's a willingness to cooperate, and I think we should have more of that. But I think that most importantly, there's a need for global collaboration on new rules for the digital ecosystem and to make it fit for the digital era so that it serves its purpose more efficiently, but also global governance of the global digital ecosystem. And I think that approach needs to be inclusive with as many partners involved as possible. And I feel, and given the differences between different collective preferences around the globe with respect to data you've already mentioned, but I think with respect to the differences that we are seeing on some digital topics, I think it would be wise for us to focus our energy and pursue a form of coexistence and a balance of dependencies across the globe, and focus on interoperability. I don't see in the short term changes in either the US approach or the European approach or the Chinese approach and Asian approach, for example, to data. But I think over the intervening period, we need to focus on coexistence. So I think in the multilateral area, there is much work that can be done. I think the ICC is doing a very good job, and I'm very happy to see the attention placed on digital documentation. I mean, at Huawei, we have been studying the connections between digitalization and trade for, let's see, about 6 or 7 years now. And a lot of the ideas that we have on multilateral collaboration are in the book that we produced. That's on the website. I have to give a plug for that. The team will thank me. And that looks at how digitalization can improve many aspects. So, but it's not just about paper. Paper is a very pragmatic one because businesses want concrete savings and efficiencies, and that has been a driving factor for global supply chains. It's the result. It's why global supply chains in the technology sector migrated in the 1980s from the US and from Europe to Southeast Asia, which gives Southeast Asia its huge advantage at the moment. And I believe that the focus of electronic manufacturing will remain in Southeast Asia because of the ecosystem that's built up around it as well. And so I think that in Southeast Asia, I was on a couple of webinars recently, if you would like me to share a few thoughts from that. And this was about digitalization of trade in ASEAN and RCEP. I mean, we've been watching that very closely here, and we've been contributing to the work. So the Nikkei, together with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, held this webinar looking at digitalization. And they came out that there was, I mean, firstly, Southeast Asia and RCEP, they've chosen connected supply chains interdependence, and that was the comments made by the Singapore Prime Minister on the signing of the RCEP agreement. So it's clear that within Asia, I think also what's interesting in Southeast Asia, we have what, 360 million consumers, and 90% of them connect via mobile apps and ICT infrastructure, which is far more than in Europe or America. So 360 million, and the predominant group are young, very entrepreneurial, very dynamic, and very much want to adopt the new digital technologies. So without suggesting that there's a race going on, but there is definitely a need, I see, looking from a global perspective, for an acceleration of this move towards digitalization of trade. Southeast Asia definitely has advantages, but Europe has many advantages too. But it's not a time for us to be divisive. It's a time for collaborating. So I think that's the essence of what I would like to suggest. I don't want to talk, I can talk more, but maybe you want to have the mic back, Oliver, to guide us through the discussion. I'm happy to talk, I'm happy to pick up questions later.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. It would be great to have Ignacio Becerro now in this round as well, because I would like to ask him if the European Commission intends to include any digital clauses in their future free trade agreements, or in the, let's say, renewal of the existing trade agreements. Unfortunately, he already had to leave. But so, Alex, back to you. Is in the bilateral negotiations the British government has initiated, I'm certain that the government definitely wants to include digital clauses. And before answering this question, maybe you could elaborate a little bit also on the activities, on the domestic activities of the UK government to improve and accelerate the use of electronic documents in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, of course, thinking about it from the kind of domestic perspective, we've kind of separated off the administrative side on one hand. So, I mean, I think Chris was getting at this earlier. That's kind of the pure paperless trade piece, where what processes and systems are customs authorities putting in place to be able to accept and issue electronic documents. I think that's one side of the piece, but arguably the more important piece is that ecosystem. So really, when it comes to kind of businesses, commercial parties, is there the kind of baseline ecosystem that allows them to use digital means for their transactions? And here we've got a number of kind of ongoing projects between the British government and the Law Commission of England and Wales, so a kind of independent body, but funded by the government. And the first one of those projects is on electronic trade documents. And this is really setting the rules that enable the enforceability of electronic bills of lading, your electronic bills of exchange, electronic promissory notes. So that is a kind of exciting piece of work of its own right, but it's just the first step before we then transition on to the next stage, which is kind of digital assets, and then after that, a smart contracts research projects. So I think it's very much the beginning when it comes to legal reforms for digitization, because there's a number of quite complex issues which are really kind of underdeveloped. You know, how can you replicate the functions of paper processes in the digital world? So you know, the lawyers in the UK will be busy researching and developing those solutions from the domestic front. But was there a kind of, on the international side, a further question? I mean, yeah, I think if you see the kind of bilateral trade agreements that the UK has negotiated to date, that digital trade features very prominently in, you know, what we are trying to achieve and how, you know, we are trying, you know, the priorities that we have for those negotiations. Obviously, the kind of rules on data flows are central to that. That's, I mean, arguably the most important provisions in those digital trade chapters, ensuring that data can flow. But then within that or underneath that, you have a number of kind of ancillary bolt-on issues. So protection of source code, protection of encryption keys, so that businesses can be sure when they're trading across border that their kind of intellectual property and trade secrets are protected. And then on the other side of that, you have the kind of electronic transactions agenda. So whilst it's fine for the UK, say, to look at these issues from a domestic perspective and ensure that e-contracts, e-bills of lading are valid domestically, you know, fundamentally, we're talking about cross-border transactions, particularly in the trade space. So it's not good enough to reform in silos. I think this is where the kind of trade commitments come into it, where you can kind of bind your trading partners to reform. And so you have these kind of lockstep legal reforms, so that a business that is operating, you know, they've issued a contract with English as the governing law. If it comes to enforcement in a third jurisdiction, you know, they have to have confidence that those electronic transactions are recognized in third jurisdictions as well. So I think that harmonization is a key theme through the bilateral trade agreements as well.
Anything you want to comment, Chris, on the domestic situation and the international activities of the UK government?
Well, I think it's interesting. Well, there was a G7 event last week, and I was being asked, you know, what do I think about the G7 trade track? And I think on the electronic I mean, there's lots of achievements, I think, through that trade track, but I think this is a really good example of incisive action from the G7. You know, we've been stumbling around this agenda for 20 years plus. The e-commerce negotiations from the WTO will take some more time. Alex has mentioned the 2023 timeframe, MC13. But so we've had some really precise intervention, very focused around electronic transferable records. Not everybody understands it, but it's actually a really important pain point for business, particularly for small business around the world. And it's really made a difference. We've suddenly got a commitment across the G7 countries to have a look at this space, making commitments around aligning frameworks and harmonization. This is a real game changer. I think we'll look back at 2021 and say that was actually the breakthrough year when the big economies really came on board. And that's really primarily because of G7 intervention. So, you know, it'd be great if Germany continued that, because there's a lot more work to be done. We've got a lot more economies to kind of get on board. And then I think there's a message. I was talking to a couple of Pacific Island economies actually with the UNSCAP network this morning. And, you know, the point here is that it's a journey, isn't it? We've all got to start. It's very complex, but let's not overcomplicate it. There are complicated issues around data, and I totally agree with Craig's point. We just need a pragmatic approach where we can coexist with each other, at least in the short to medium term. But let's not get too folded in with the electronic transferable records. That's a very practical piece of work that we can get on with while this bigger, more strategic dialogue is going on, particularly between China, EU, US. But if we bundle it all together, nothing's going to happen for another however many years. So we've just got to sort of slightly decouple the two, get on really practically, because we can really make a difference. There's a big prize to be had here. And if we can do that through the G7 and G20, and then scale that up through the networks, particularly in the ASEAN, Africa, and other networks, EU too, then we can really make, you know, proper ground, more ground actually than we've ever made before on this agenda. And that in itself will make a transformative difference. This is the largest, most transformative initiative in world trade, in my view, without question. It'd be great for the Germans to take that forward.
Well, Harald, I know that you are not able to speak about the priorities of the German G7 presidency, but do you think that through this activities, through this decision on electronically transferable records and the declaration of last Fridays, there's also a new momentum within the German government and the coalition partners to move the digital issue further and to engage in let's say cross resort department activities to really push things further ahead?
Well, two of the three parties who are now negotiating on the new program for government really push for to accelerate digitization in Germany. I mean, it's not a completely new issue, the digitization. We had legislation on digitization already in the 90s as one of the first countries in Europe, at least. But what lacks is the practical implementation, at least, yeah, within the government, within authorities, electronic administrative procedures, and so on. So that's really a problem at the moment. And I would be optimistic that we can continue the process and at least further discussing the electronic transferable records. I can't give a definitive answer, as Mr. Wieck pointed out, but at least we supported the project from the outset, and especially because it's such a practical example of digitization. It's not too big, it's not too abstract, like free flow of data is very abstract, but here we are talking about a single document, which is known to many countries actually, and so there's a good outlook that we can achieve something. What I wanted to point out, another aspect I wanted to point out is the international negotiations by UNCITRAL, the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. They are planning to start negotiations on a convention on a negotiable multimodal transport document. So that would not only encompass maritime trade, but also trade, let's say, on the road, by rail, and so on. And I think here we have the unique opportunity to actually think in electronics. In all other agreements, we were in the situation that, we had in mind a paper document, and then perhaps we defined additional rules for the electronic document. But here we could start from scratch, from an electronic document, and then maybe have some special provisions for paper.
That's an interesting development. Do you want to comment on that, Craig and Chris, from a business perspective?
Well, I think it's interesting to turn it around. Actually, that's a really interesting point. You know, if we're designing new laws, to design it for digital with a clause, or for paper, it turn the whole thing around. I think that's absolutely the right way to go, isn't it? But I just make the point around these documents. That it's not just about transport documents as well, right? We've got 27 documents, or up to 27 documents overall. They cut across a lot of departments. Actually, seven departments is quite normal. And we really need all of them to go digital. So I think that's a really important aspect. And as I understand it, in Germany, there are 3 documents that are still not able to go digital. That's promissory notes and bills of exchange and transport insurance certificates. So, if we can get those digital, then the system can start to really transform itself. I think that's and then get those implementing regulations so we get adoption. That's super important. There's a big prize here for the German economy. I keep saying that to everybody. There's a big prize for us all, but the German economy is a big one, and that's why we're focusing on the G7 report, and it has its own report, because if Germany really make a move in this space, then many others will follow, and that's the big focus. But and having that leadership of the G7 next year is a real opportunity, I think, to lead by example and make it happen. It's a big prize. And it's doable.
Yeah, and we won't let loose Harald Schön. We are right now, we launched a working group, and we will come up hopefully in the second quarter of next year with a very concrete proposal on how an implementing regulation could look like, so that in the end, electronic documents are used, and not only transport document, but also the other documents which Chris just mentioned. Back to you, Craig. I know that you mentioned it in some degree, but could you elaborate in more detail how Huawei contributes to the fostering of a better global business environment for digital technologies to unlock the full potential of digital trade? beyond the reports you just showed us?
Well, I'm very happy that you quoted from that document in your introduction describing it.
How did you know?
So it means I recognize writing those words. But I wanted to point out that Huawei takes a great interest in the digital ecosystem and digitalization because that's in the DNA of the company. And it invests huge amounts of money in research and development into new ways of doing things. ICT infrastructure is clearly an enabler for all sectors of the economy. So, you know, OECD has produced reports on increasing the degree of connectivity by 10%. More investment, you know, can increase the trade, and it's especially important in FTAs or mutual because that can increase trade by like 3%, and 2% for the goods trade. So there are lots of figures on that as well. So we've paid a lot of attention to that. And writing the documents, we've also written on digital FDI, foreign direct investment, which is a great interest to countries around the world. So we work with many countries on the digitalization of processes, and we supply to our customers, the telecoms operators, the equipment which is then made for to improve the ICT infrastructure. There's a lot of investment going on here with digital and 5G plans. I wanted to just add to the point that when Chris and I were discussing the paperless trade initiative some years ago, there are other aspects which I think are very interesting for all businesses. Digital trust services are going to boom and are starting, so that protects personal data. Digital identity is a very important way of going digital, which facilitates setting up companies much faster. I mean, quite often the know your client process for banks can take months, whereas if everything's available digitally, you get a company set up so fast. E-payment solutions. Singapore is leading by issuing a banking license in 2020, the first ones, for wholly online banking, which would enable the creation of portals to provide trade finance. And that would particularly benefit small and medium-sized enterprises if all of that goes online. So all of these processes, so electronic invoicing as well. So there are many other aspects that we've been studying, and they all point towards the need for global collaboration on these new rules for this digital trade ecosystem. And in the opening remarks, you said that countries that have put digital at the core of their trade and economy policies are going to have a distinct advantage in the future, and that's very clear. We see across the world different speeds of uptake of 5G. Some are very fast in many of the Middle Eastern countries, we've noticed. Some are much slower, and those differences in speed and uptake also, you know, goes into the question of digital competitiveness, which in many respects is growing as a metric to measure between countries. But we're a big supporter, and that's why I was very happy to support the 3 reports in the UK and for the G7 and for Germany, because it's a topic that I personally take a great deal of interest in, and I wish it all a great success. I think it's ideal for global collaboration.
Well, thank you very much, Craig. In the interest of time and by the fact that we already have 12:30 right now, I want to take this opportunity and thank all panelists for their active engagement, for a very lively discussion. We didn't solve all the problems. We identified new challenges, new areas which can be electronified. So, but anyhow, I think it was very helpful to get not only a European view on the issues, but also the view from the Asian perspective, from the international business community. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining. Well, dear participants from all over the world, thank you very much for joining us, for sharing for following our views. It was great to have you with us, and we very much appreciate the time you spent with us. This year's ICC Forum on the Future of International Supply Chains comes to an end, but as you could see from the last panel, the discussion will continue. I again thank all our partners and all panelists who have provided so many new insights, ideas, views, and visions on current developments, on the challenges and future opportunities regarding supply chains of the future. Thank you very much for joining. Stay tuned, and we will certainly come back next year with a new issue of our International Forum on Supply Chains. Thank you very much, and have a nice day.
Thank you.